in central Los Angeles, what's happening is completely out of hand. That's why I called on Governor Newsom to declare a disaster. We're simply saying to him, please let us help your small business. And he's saying, no, no thanks.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. Great to have you with us. We've got some fantastic conversations coming up on today's show, starting with Kelly Loeffler. She is the administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration. She's a member of Donald Trump's cabinet, and she's going to tell us something really interesting about the L.A. riots and the connection to small business. Very close to my heart. If you've been following what I was doing during those riots and all the lawlessness and chaos, just the way that small local businesses are just destroyed by that is absolutely heartbreaking and infuriating. And wait till you hear what Kelly tells us. It'll make you even more mad at the totally feckless response to all this of Gavin Newsom here in California. Then we have a conversation about a policy that I'm launching this week on crime. I hope you can check it out. But there's a really, really detailed conversation about how we got to this terrible situation in California on crime and the lawlessness and chaos we see everywhere. It's been going on for years and years and years. And there's a fantastic guest coming up to tell us about that, Dan Kolkey. He's been a serious player in California legal matters for many, many years now, including working side by side with Governor Wilson. And he's a very important advisor to me in my run for governor on all sorts of matters. And he's here today to tell us about the story on crime and what we can do to turn it around. And then the policy that I announced a few weeks ago, you may remember, on gas prices. We actually taped an interview then, but we didn't use it because there was lots of news came along in terms of the situation in Los Angeles and so on. So this is a conversation with someone who's very well known to anyone who follows the gas prices issue nationally. He's known as the GasBuddy guy, Patrick Haan. He's all over the media anytime there's anything to do with gas prices. And it was such an informative conversation about gas prices, how that all works. And we talked about my plan for $3 gas, which is what I announced a few weeks ago. You may remember, instead of where we're heading with Gavin Newsom and the Democrats, which is $9 gas, which is, of course, completely insane. We're going to turn that around, $3 gas here in California. And the GasBuddy guy is here to tell us all about that. And one thing I just want to mention, my voice was absolutely terrible at the time of that conversation. Thankfully, it's back, as you can hear, but it was really a bad one that day. And so apologies for that, but it was a really great and informative conversation. So hope you enjoy all of that. Here's the show. And joining me now, U.S. Small Business Administrator, member of Donald Trump's cabinet, Kelly Loeffler. It's so great to see you. I've been dying to have this conversation. I love everything you're doing, and I love the energy you bring to the role. And as someone who myself has started businesses that, in the end, they kind of stayed small. I know most businesses you want to grow and turn into a large business, but we had restaurants, which are in many ways the heart of small businesses in communities back in the day in London. And on the road in California, I'm constantly meeting small businesses, feeling their pain, which is a very high level in California because of all the nonsense that I'm sure we'll get into. But I wanted to start with, we'll get into your broader role and the big, beautiful bill and how that connects to small businesses. But I want to start with, the sort of current story, really, which is the riots that we saw in Los Angeles. I've spoken a lot about that from the law and order point of view, but actually there's a really interesting small business aspect that you've been focused on. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Steve. I mean, look, you're absolutely right. Small businesses are the heartbeat of our community. They're the growth engines of our community, too. They create 2 out of every 3 new jobs. But right now in central Los Angeles, what's happening is completely out of hand. And that's why I called on Governor Newsom to declare a disaster. And when he declares an official disaster from the state, then we can come in from the SBA and provide disaster loans so that what we estimate the $1 billion in damage that has taken place in that community, that they can start to rebuild and recover. And it's not just the looting, the graffiti, all the break-ins. It's the lack of business. It's the economic injury that small businesses are suffering because people aren't going to head into that war zone right now.
It's exactly right. I mean, look, I was in LA for most of last week, documenting what was happening. The graffiti was unbelievable, and on every single surface, and so disgraceful. But the way that these thugs and just smashing up small businesses. I went to one that got a lot of attention, a Japanese restaurant, where they just stormed in and started kind of smashing things up and looting mindlessly. The news story will move on. What will happen to that restaurant and the countless restaurants and other businesses like it?
Well, that's the question, and it's the intimidation of the customers. It's the intimidation of the small business owners. Can they trust city officials, the mayor, to keep them safe? And that's where small businesses need our support. We offered it several times. We contacted the governor's office to declare that disaster so that they could get these low interest rate small business recovery loans. And they've declined to do that. So they're not supporting small businesses. That's why we see this outflow of business. And it's heartbreaking because obviously, as you know, California is an incredible state that these leaders have managed to really destroy.
So this is a really interesting point. So I just want to make sure everyone understands the process. So you are ready to help, and the specific help is a low interest loan. Is that right? And it comes from your office.
Yeah, it's a very low interest rate, a 3.5%, 4% loan over 30 years that small businesses can take their time to pay back while they rebuild. It gives them immediate access to the capital that they need to get their doors back open. And it gives them the confidence to do that amid tremendous local headwinds. But they know that this administration has their back, just as it did during the California wildfires. Look, you know this. President Trump was out there within the week he was inaugurated. I followed up. I went to visit California to help with the rebuild. The governor was begging the federal government to get involved and provide those loans for disaster recovery. We did that to the tune of $2 billion. We're simply saying to him, please let us help your small business. And he's saying, no, no, thanks.
Is that legislation that prevents you from doing it? What's the process here?
That's right. It is a requirement that the state request a disaster declaration. He has it within his purview to do that. But you know as well as I do, that would be him declaring the disaster that he once again created. And he's stopping short of doing that because, look, he's also trying to win the 2028 presidential nomination for the Democrats. So this is all wrapped up in politics on the backs of our hardworking small businesses.
It's really outrageous because it's a parallel to how this whole situation in Los Angeles began, which is them just refusing to confront reality for political reasons. So the whole thing started when you had ICE agents requesting help from local law enforcement for protection when they were physically threatened, and local law enforcement on the orders of Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass saying no, we're not going to help you, and that's what led to the whole thing. And now it's the same kind of pattern. And the reason for that, they didn't want to look as if they were helping ICE and Trump with their immigration policy. And it's the same now. It's politics, pure politics. They don't want to look as if they're admitting that a disaster occurred on his watch. It's absolutely unbelievable, actually, the more I think about it. I didn't realize what a terrible. It's just the same old story with Newsom. It's always politics and his
Yeah.
personal position over, doing the job properly.
Well, and they're hoping to keep it quiet that no one will notice, and that's why we've been very public about our decision to move out of sanctuary cities for the SBA regional offices. And that decision was so supported in Congress on a bipartisan basis that 2 weeks ago they passed a bipartisan bill to move regional offices of the SBA out of sanctuary cities that will not protect their workers, their small businesses. And so we were validated in that just days later when those riots broke out in Los Angeles, in New York, just steps from the SBA office. And if they aren't going to fight for their people, we are going to be in a place where it's safe for small businesses to access the resources to start and grow a business.
And there's another parallel on the emergency, the disaster thing, where it's the same kind of thing in relation to the sewage situation down in San Diego. I went and documented that. You've had Mexicans' raw sewage pouring into onto our beaches in San Diego, and where the Navy SEALs train and so on. And you've got all the local mayors in that area, including Democrats, begging Newsom to declare a disaster, and that unlocks federal support. He won't do it there either. It's just unbelievable. Small businesses, and the way that these Democrat politicians endlessly go on about it. Oh, but we love small business, but not enough, it seems, to actually do anything to help them.
They want their votes and their tax dollars, but the number one job of government at every level is to keep their people safe. And we've seen the opportunity for them to do that every time, and they turn their backs on it every time. Even economically safe. We have every Democrat voting for the massive $4 trillion tax increase. It's really astounding. And they hope that the American people won't put it together. But obviously, last November 5th, they did. And they said it's enough.
Yeah. And so, I mean, just to sort of finish on this point, what if he did turn around and say, right, I'm declaring a disaster, which is a very simple, quick thing to do, then how quickly could the money start flowing? What's your process in terms of helping small businesses?
Well, we have our small business disaster recovery centers that could be activated right away. We have people in the field. In fact, right now across the country, we have over 400 disaster relief people in the field supporting disasters in over 600 counties. We've got 30 active disasters. People are staffed, and then 1,300 across the counties in the last several months. So we're able to deploy quickly. We're ready to go. Those loans can start flowing right away. So it wouldn't be a long, extended process. And they've got 6 months to apply for it. They wouldn't have to rush in. They'd have 6 months. So, this is a process that the governor should welcome. It would support his state's recovery and economic growth. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the mayor will put pressure on him to support her city.
Well, exactly. Well, I certainly will on them, and that's a very easy pledge for me to make, that if I were the governor now, I would be doing this. But of course, there's a broader point, which is as governor, I could declare an emergency on almost everything, because nearly everything is a disaster in California. So it's not hard to find areas where that word applies, if not the
That's
legal
right.
status. But let's just move to the broader point. Big beautiful bill. Lots of discussion around that, and again, the small business aspect hasn't really been sort of top of the story there. What is the involvement of your agency, and how does that connect to the bill?
Well, the One Big Beautiful Bill is a small business, pro-worker, America First bill. It makes permanent the existing pass-through deduction that supports small businesses. Currently, it's 20%. There's talk of raising that income deduction to 23%. If it does not pass, it would make small businesses taxes double. And I don't know any small businesses that can afford their tax bill doubling. That's what every Democrat voted for, was to double taxes on small businesses. But it would also make our rates 20% higher than what the Chinese small business pays to the Communist Party. So this is what they're voting for. But it does so many other things. It allows small businesses to expense 100% of capital investments of R&D. We know so much innovation comes from our small startup businesses. It would create Made in America incentives by allowing 100% deduction for building factories in America. 99% of all manufacturers in this country qualify as small businesses. So there's so many great things. And then it's pro-worker. And every single small business I talk to says they need more skilled labor. They want more people to be encouraged into the workforce. That's what this bill does, because it lowers your taxes and it creates incentives to get off government-backed welfare. It reforms those programs that makes work requirements. And I think everyone supports there be some work requirement if you're able to.
For sure. It's exactly right. I mean, I remember reading the details, and it's just not in the, that when you look at how many, well, you tell us the story. I'm sure you know better than I do, how important this is in terms of the proportion of our businesses and the proportion of employment that is small businesses, and how, when you talk about tax rates, for a small business, the personal and the business, it's so connected. Just explain all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to level set, small businesses make up 99% of all businesses in this country. So most businesses qualify as small. It's, 1 to 500 employees, uh, under 5 million in net receipts, all that stuff. But the bigger picture is they create 2 out of every 3 new jobs in this country. And under President Trump, we've seen this uh, employment boom, over 500,000 jobs created, and that's because small businesses are thriving. But the tax rate is critical because these are pass-throughs. Small businesses are sole proprietorships, partnerships, S corps, and that means that the pass-through rate is your individual rate. So that's why it's unconstrained to the highest tax rate under your small business. The corporate tax rate in America is 21%. So small businesses could be paying more than twice what the corporate tax rate is. And they have access to all kinds of capital and resources. And here is a small business person, a restaurateur, is trying to make it on their own, and they face this doubling of taxes. The other thing it does, like for restaurants, no tax on tip, no tax on overtime. We've been talking to workers, whether it's waitresses or welders. Just yesterday, I had those conversations. This is incredibly important to their take home pay. That's why every family on average would benefit by $13,000 annually from this tax bill.
That's an amazing number. Um, can you just explain pass through for those who aren't, really familiar with it, and from an accounting point of view, what does that really mean? What's that phrase really mean?
Very simply, it's your income that would be taxed at your personal rate. But if you have it in an LLC or an S corp, you're a sole proprietor or a partnership, they look to your personal income tax bracket to tax you. But under the small business deduction, it's section 199A for anyone who wants to look it up. You can take off 20% of your small business, your gig economy, whatever your earnings are, and subtract that from your taxable income. So to get that 20% taken off the top and just be taxed on the remainder is really transformative to a small business who operates on such thin margins. And that allows you to reinvest, to hire, and to grow.
Just sort of looking broadly at the sort of landscape for small business. I mean, obviously in California, I mean, I make this point the whole time, they're hit the hardest by these insane I mean, I keep using that word insane. I mean, it sort of is insane to a normal person, but but for the Democrats, it's not like they don't know what they're doing. It's ideological. They're doing it on purpose. But the end result is so difficult. It's the labor regulations, the environmental regulations, the taxes, and so on. So I know how bad it is in California. When you look across the country, and you're on the road, I believe, a lot, and I'd love to hear about that. Who's doing it really well? Which are I mean, you're going to say Georgia, but which states do you look to and think, yeah, that's a great model for how to treat small businesses?
Well, obviously, I'm very partial to Georgia, number one state in the country to do business. But I will also say that the red states have it right. Look, they're bringing taxes down. They're cutting regulation. They're putting more freedom in their residents' hands to build their businesses instead of taking control and making their cities less safe, making their regulations bigger. It's, you just see it's a night and day contrast. And so what we see with small businesses broadly, though, thanks to President Trump, small business confidence is back. So for 4 years, their number one issue was inflation. They were just crushed by 20% plus inflation and regulation. Now their number one concern is taxes. So that shows that this economy is going in the right direction because President Trump helped solve inflation, got spending under control, thanks to the Doge cuts and other prudent efforts that we're taking here. But we have a real opportunity now to get this bill passed and take small businesses' number one concern, whether you're in California or Georgia, take that off the table and let them get back to growing, get the government crowding out of the way, and give them their economic freedom.
So tell us about you're on tour, as I understand it. You're around the country. What's that like?
Yeah, so it's always important to get outside of Washington. I'm a small business person. I grew up in a small business. I waited tables. I started small businesses, turned them into big, and some stayed small. And a lot of small businesses want to stay small, and that's fantastic. So I visit all kinds of small businesses. Yesterday, I was at family-owned restaurants in Louisiana. I was at a contracting business that does pipe fitting and welding. Today, we're going to be at a cigar factory and a restaurant equipment manufacturer. No matter where we go, people are grateful for the change in tides in this country in the last 6 months because they know that America is being put first, the American workers being put first. And so what I learned from them are the very specific things, what it means to a server who's bringing our food to the table, talking about no tax on tips. It's a big deal for their family. Talking to that welder, no tax on overtime. He's motivated now to work those extra hours. Maybe that apprentice sees that that career path is more lucrative now. It brings more people in. And we need more people in the trades. Skilled workforce is absolutely critical. And when you want some more of something, you tax it less. When you want less of something, you tax it more. The Democrats' plan is to tax it more. They don't want work. They don't want the opportunity and roadmap to the American dream. That's what we're bringing back in the Trump administration. And I couldn't be more proud and honored to work for the president in that regard for small businesses.
I bet you I can really sort of feel it, and I bet you it's wonderful. But I mean, I got to tell you, my version of that is just one horror story after another. When I talk to businesses in California, I mean, I'll just give you a couple just to give you a flavor of it. There was a winery, small independent winery in wine country here, and this lady who owns it, she said she wanted to expanded her patio, and so to have more visitors able to come. So she had to apply for a new permit to increase her permit from 30 maximum visitors to 50. It took her 6 years and $1 million in fees and environmental consultants and all this nonsense, like inspections and what lawyers. 6 years and $1 million to go from 30 to 50 visitors. How about that?
I believe it. I've heard the horror stories firsthand, but I've also heard from states where small businesses start and they are delighted. There's demand for their product. They're up and running. And that's part of my job at the SBA is to advocate for small businesses and shine a light on that and make sure that people understand that they're crushing opportunity when they wrap those entrepreneurial dreams in red tape. And we've got to get away from that. And thank you for calling all that out because people need to know what's going on.
Yes, one last one, just to sort of tuck away. This was a pest control business, and this again for a female entrepreneur, and she was saying that they have to, pesticides, and okay, we want to make sure that things are protected, or whatever. She has to report everything she uses for every site, every client, and she was telling me it's a nightmare because she's got to report to the state pesticide control board, and also each county's agriculture department. And they all have different reporting mechanisms, and some of them it's online, and some of it's a physical for all this. I said, "Oh my gosh, you have to do that every year." She says, "No, every month, to 9." She's in 9 counties. She has to report separately to 9 counties and the state every month.
I believe it. I grew up on a family farm in a small trucking business. I saw my parents every night after dinner. It was paperwork every night, paperwork. And it was just crushing them 50 years ago. I can't imagine what she's going through now, especially in California.
It's a nightmare. Anyway, look, it's just fantastic to see you, actually. I'm really happy to see you. And I love that you're bringing that experience to this. And by the way, that's what's so great about this administration from the president down. You got people who really understand and love great businesses of all sizes in all sectors. Like I do, and I just love to see it, and that's what I want to bring in California. So I'm going to make sure we put the pressure on here for the disaster declaration in relation to the riots. And then just last question for you: if people want to kind of follow, excuse me, what you're doing and your work and so on, what should they be looking out for?
Yeah, so we're on X, SBA_Kelly, and that's my X handle. And then check out the SBA website. It's not sexy, but it's full of information about how small businesses can access our capital, our government contracting that we help facilitate, as well as our counseling to help them start and grow their small business, sba.gov.
Fantastic. Great to see you today. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve.
And now joining me for a conversation about crime and the policy that I'm announcing this week on prisons and how we can turn things around on the law and order issue here in California, my friend Dan Kolkey. Dan, it is great to see you today. Just for our audience to be aware, you are my go-to on pretty much everything serious and important in relation to California, the role of the governor, what I will be able to do when I'm the governor within the Constitution and within the law in order to bring about the changes that we need to see. Could you just tell everyone a little bit who haven't met you before, your background and particularly your work with Governor Wilson. I think that's highly relevant to what we're going to be discussing.
All right. So I'm an appellate attorney. I represented Governor Wilson on the redistricting litigation of the state that resulted in one of the first fair reapportionments and redistrictings for the state in the 1990s. I became his counsel for his second term. After that, he appointed me to the bench, and I was an associate justice on the California Court of Appeal. And following that, I was Arnold Schwarzenegger's negotiator for 2 years. And following that, I returned to my law firm practice.
I think that counts as a highly distinguished and a lot of experience in California law. But today we're going to be talking about criminal justice crime and the way that that's been allowed to explode as a direct result of policy choices made by the people in charge, by the Democrats. Let's start with some of the statutes. I know you've been digging into this. If you could just sort of tell the story of how we've got to the point we have in relation to crime in California.
There's a couple of big features there. One, of course, is that with the tough on crime laws in the late 80s and 90s, crime was reduced significantly, and Democrats in particular were claiming, well, why do we have such tough on crime laws when there isn't much crime? Not understanding that it was the tough on crime laws that had reduced the amount of crime. And then the big opening occurred, and that was a U.S. Supreme Court decision called Brown versus Plata. The Brown was Jerry Brown. And the U.S. Supreme Court held that the overcrowding of California's prisons, which were at 137% of their capacity, that overcrowding constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment. And the state had to reduce the capacity of these prisons by either building more prisons or releasing prisoners.
What year was that?
So that was 2011. With that, Jerry Brown, who had a history of being softer on crime than the Republican governors, used that decision to then get law passed by the legislature. It was AB 109 in 2011, and it allowed nonviolent, non-serious offenders to be housed at the county level. In other words, moving these prisoners from the overcrowded prisons to the county jails. And of course, the problem is that the county jails, really weren't equipped to handle such a surge of these criminal defendants. And the other thing is, if a criminal defendant who was on parole violated parole, they went back to state prison. But if they were in the county jail, the most that could be done was a short-term return to county jail, which really didn't have the capacity for the return of these particular criminals, or they would just go on electric monitoring or do community service. So the violation of parole was then kind of reduced in terms of the sort of penalty that it resulted in. With that shift, the next year, Jerry Brown started pushing changes to the three strikes law. And you may recall the three strikes law was enacted in 1994, both by statute and by initiative by the people. And that provided that if a person had committed 2 serious or violent felonies, the next time, the third strike, where they committed any felony, they had 25 years to life. And by the way, as a judge, I would see the rap sheets of these 3 strike defendants, and it wasn't as if they just did 2 serious or violent felonies and then 1 felony following it. Their rap sheet was generally very long, with all kinds of misdemeanors that led to the serious felonies and then the violent felonies, and then finally the final felony. In any event, what Jerry Brown did, and it sounded reasonable, but it didn't really understand the dynamics, was it said the third strike had to be serious or violent in order to trigger 3 strikes. And by the way, this then required resentencing of those who had been sentenced to 25 years to life who had had a third strike as a felony. But the real problem was that because you now had to have a serious or violent felony for the third strike, the law defined that domestic violence was not serious or violent. Aggravated assault was not serious or violent. A felon in possession of a firearm, that was not serious or violent. And so those were no longer third strikes.
Can I just stop you there for a second? Because can you explain in relation to that the role of Prop 57? So we know about Prop 47 became very well known, notorious.
Yes.
The one 2014
Yes.
included many things, including the $950 limit. You could steal up to $950 a day,
Right.
and so on. So that was partially reversed in last year's Prop 36. A lesser known one is Prop 57. And
Yes.
am I correct in saying that was 2016? And that actually was what reduced the definition of these crimes to non-violent. Is that correct?
It may have been that some of these crimes already were designated as nonviolent, but what 57 did is it allowed the early release of state prison inmates. Again, getting them out of the prisons. So it fit very well with Jerry Brown's view that, we had too many prisoners in the prisons. And what it did is it expanded the conduct credits to the offenders, and it also reduced the length of many sentences. But the bottom line is that it granted early release of any inmate convicted of a nonviolent offense. So if you had a nonviolent offense, you got early release. And now listen to what the nonviolent felonies were that were subject to early release under Prop 57. Rape of an unconscious person. That was considered a nonviolent felony. Supplying a firearm to a gang member. That was a nonviolent or serious felony. Hostage taking, that was a nonviolent and not serious felony.
I believe domestic violence again is in 57. How can it? I mean, this is Alice in Wonderland territory. That you have a crime with violence in its name.
Yes,
defined by the law as non-violent. What is this?
Well, I mean, hostage taking. I guess it's just assumed that if you took a hostage, you were very kind to the hostage, and you were feeding the hostage, and providing anything that they needed. I mean, so no, it's and by the way, Proposition 57 was intended actually to be an entirely different proposition. Jerry Brown hijacked it near the end of his term and imposed his provisions, really undoing what the original Proposition 57 was that had been submitted as an initiative before the Attorney General's office, and filled in his Proposition 57 material for the early release of state prison inmates. All these things with the, moving the inmates to county jails and then releasing them and so on. If you look at the statistics from 2012 to 2022 that the California State Attorney General's office put together, it shows that between 2012 and 2022, rape has doubled. Homicides are up 17% over that 10-year period. The fact of the matter is that, California is not safer by reason of these laws that are providing for early release and diluting the three strikes law. And as I said before, when I looked at the rap sheets of these three strikers, when there was an issue before the Court of Appeal as to, whether or not it was appropriate to impose three strikes, these were lengthy rap sheets. This person was really a professional criminal, a career criminal.
So what you've had is, starting in 2011 with AB 109, a succession of moves to lower the penalties and reduce accountability for serious crime. And that's basically what's happened, accompanied by a reduction in prison capacity and the transfer, and therefore transferring of some prisoners to county jails, and beyond that, offenders from any kind of incarceration to just being on the streets. That's really what's been happening for the last, it's now 15 years, really.
Right, and it's been very cleverly done, because when you transfer all these people to the county jails, they can't handle them. And don't forget that county jails had traditionally been handling people with misdemeanors or people who were awaiting trial.
and again, it's very important for those who don't understand. So that's the difference, isn't it? Prison is you've been convicted. Everyone in there's been convicted and sentenced. Jail, some of the people there haven't yet.
That's right. That's right. Or it's just a misdemeanor. So they can't handle it. And of course, the local sheriffs would be screaming to the legislature, we can't handle this increase of inmates who, frankly, were found to be appropriately convicted to state prison. And so they're screaming to the legislature, we can't handle this. So the legislature, rather than providing more capacity, said, well, we'll just reduce the penalties so that these people can be released earlier and you don't have to handle them. So it was, if you had this mad scientist scheme to create how we're going to do this, how we're going to release criminals onto the streets and so on, and you say, well, no, we're not releasing, we're just moving them to county jail. The county jail scream, we can't handle it. You say, all right, well, we've got to relieve that. Let's get some more, credits in there to let these people out and so on. And let's let them out if it was just a non-serious, non-violent crime, which of course we define in our own way. And then to cover up all this, and this is unbelievable, but the definition of recidivism was changed. It used to be that if you had to return to prison within 3 years of being released, that was considered a recidivist. So the definition was changed that you had to be convicted of a new felony or misdemeanor committed within 3 years of release from custody. Now, why does that make a difference? Because if you're released for 2 years and then you commit a felony, you may not be convicted in the next year. It might take 13 months. In fact, depending upon the severity of the felony, it might take much longer before you're convicted. So as long as you weren't convicted again within 3 years, you're not a recidivist. Whereas before, you just had to be returned to prison. It went from being confined within 3 years to being convicted within 3 years. And it sounds reasonable enough, but of course, it takes time for the conviction process to take place.
So they wanted to cover up, they wanted to reduce the numbers of reoffend, statistically reduce the numbers of the appearance of reoffending.
Right.
It's unbelievable. So then I wanted to ask you just to comment quickly on, so we've talked a lot in this conversation about serious and violent and the kinds of, very, very high level crimes, as it were, where people should have been in state prison and early release, transferred to county jails and so on. Talk a little bit about the impact of all this on I don't particularly like the term, but because it affects people very deeply in our quality of life, but what's sometimes referred to as low-level crimes, and the kind of chaos you see on the streets and that deterioration in a sense of order on the streets, where you've got people wandering around with various problems, and how does the county jail overcrowding connect to that?
I don't know if I've got a good answer in terms of how the county jail thing relates to it. But what I will say is that the problem is that before Proposition 47, and 36 tries to fix this a little bit, but before Proposition 47, police could use the fact that someone was completely drugged out and an addict and so on, and they could say, you either, go to treatment, or you're going to be convicted, and go to prison. And once 47 reduced all these penalties, because it not only reduced the penalties with respect to shoplifting, with respect to stealing $950 or less, which you could do multiple times, and as long as it was no more than $950, it was a misdemeanor. It also turned a lot of drug offenses into misdemeanors. And as a misdemeanor, the police just had no leverage to get the person to go into a treatment program or go to prison, because with a misdemeanor, they're just not going to stay in jail very long. So they lost their leverage. Now, 36, as I understand, and I haven't studied 36, has helped change that a bit, and it provides more leverage to get these people who actually need help out of their addiction and off the street. Newsom, of course, did these care courts, but it is very constrained. I don't have in front of me the constraints on who qualifies to go to these care courts, but it's fairly voluntary. You can't force someone unless there's parents or friends who seek a conservatorship of some sort to get this person into treatment. So it may be that 36 may help that, but it's something that really ought to be studied by the governor's office as to how do we help these people?
Well, exactly. Well, that's the point of, I mean, you have drug mandated felony and so on. You've got these different penalties now in 36. But I wanted to go, I want to sort of turn to the question of what we can do about it. So the decarceration agenda, as they call it, no one really should be in jail. Jail is bad. Prison's bad. It's racist, so on, which is driving a lot of this, was continued by Gavin Newsom. He closed 4 state prisons.
Yes.
And so we have basically a massive drop. Now we're under 100,000, about 90,000 in state prison. By the way, the amazing point along with this massive prison closure program is that the budget of the Department of Corrections has increased every year despite that. And it's now more than double what it was at the beginning of this whole process. So they're just shutting prisons but spending more. Amazing. Well, it's not amazing because it's California. But the question I have is, so the legal the laws that have been put in place, I, as governor, would not be able to unilaterally reverse. But what I can do, and I would love the comment on this, and we'll close with this, is if I were governor, I could reverse the prison closure program, create more capacity in the system, and affect some of the decisions in relation to parole through appointments to the parole board. That's right, isn't it?
That's right. Also, you can do what Schwarzenegger did with respect to the prison capacity, is that he contracted out to private prison companies. And indeed, there was litigation by the corrections officers, CCPOA, against Schwarzenegger for basically exercising his emergency powers to contract with these private prison corporations, which was just a interim measure, until there could be new construction. And I wrote an amicus brief in support of what he did, and the court basically agreed with the points in the amicus brief, which said that the governor did have the right to exercise his emergency powers to do this, and that a provision in the state constitution that provides for a civil service did not preclude private prison guards under these circumstances to be the ones that were handling these inmates in these private corrections companies. So that's an interim measure that has been upheld by the California Court of Appeal as an appropriate measure that the governor can take, while a governor then works to increase the capacity of the prisons within the state.
Well, that is the policy that I've announced this week. That as governor, I would increase prison capacity so that we can start to reverse this incredibly damaging story that's been plaguing us for so long now. And as part of that, to work to change this legislation with the legislature so that we keep people safe and also offer effective rehabilitation. That's the other point. If you don't have enough capacity, everybody's overstretched. You can't do the work that's really necessary to get people to help them get their lives back on track, whether that's a combination of drug treatment, mental health treatment, job training. So many people in prison and dyslexic, literacy, all these things can be done properly if you have enough capacity. So that is why, to me, it's a really leading an example of the leading role that the governor can play. I know, law enforcement is very decentralized. Sheriffs and mayors and police chiefs and so on, it's very decentralized. DAs, of course, that's true. But as governor, this issue of the state prisons is something that I can really make a difference on, and I plan to, with your help, Dan. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you joining us today.
My pleasure.
All right, so how could we have a conversation about gas prices without talking to the GasBuddy guy, Patrick Haan? I've been watching you for so many years. You were the first person I thought of when I wanted to discuss this plan that I've got to take us in the right direction in California. instead of up to $9 gas with Gavin Newsom and the Democrats, $3 gas. And people in California, when I say that, it's like, how is that even possible? That seems so wildly unrealistic. And I say, yeah, it's just in line with what we have in the rest of the country, but you follow it very closely. Before we get into all of that, tell us a little bit about how you became this national guru of gas prices.
Well, it's always something that fascinated me. I think there are a lot of answers that were not known at the time. I mean, when I started doing what I'm doing now for a living almost 20 years ago, that was kind of even before in the early days of things like Google. And so, you see the gas price go up. Nobody seemed to have a logical explanation for what in the heck's going on. So I started to kind of put two and two together. I used to be a student that have to commute about 20 or 30 miles a day, and I'd go out to campus and gas might be, and hold on here, gas might be only $1.40 a gallon. And on the way back from classes, it would be $1.70. And I would think, what in the course of 3 hours or 4 hours caused prices to go up? So I started to do some digging, and I guess I've done 20 years of digging now or so, and I've got a couple answers.
So how much of it would you say is market driven versus government driven?
Well, in California, I mean, at the basis for how gas prices are set, you have supply and demand and how those are changing on a daily basis. Now, in an area like California, like I said, there's a lot of layers of bureaucracy, requirements, stringent regulations that can interrupt that balance of supply and demand. In this case, it can restrict the ability for producers to produce as much gasoline or build their facilities as large as they need to be able to support that market demand. And in California, the regulatory environment has been so tight that it's almost artificially squeezed it. And it's led to a lot of these price spikes that you see in California now. So as you mentioned, Californians are paying $1.60 more per gallon on average every single day than the rest of America. It's the nation's most expensive market. And so in this instance, we can safely say that California, I mean, well over $1 a gallon is specific to California. And a lot of that is because of regulations, policies, things that have built up over the course of time, some, including the nation's highest gasoline tax that we'll probably be talking about that is layered onto this. So it's all of these regulations have created this kind of convoluted mess, this choke point that doesn't allow the free market system to work in California. And that leads to gas prices that are much higher.
So we always talk in California about the fact that we have the highest. Who has typically the lowest? Is there one or a set of states that are always the best, or does that fluctuate?
It does fluctuate a little bit more. You tend to see areas in the deep South, the Gulf states, Mississippi, Texas, places that have, number one, low gasoline taxes, some of the lowest gasoline taxes in the Gulf states. But you also have proximity to not only refineries that produce gasoline, but you have access to infrastructure. A lot of what you see in the South is very low energy because you're just so close to those areas that are producing it. And so that's the combination that leads to some of those low prices in areas of the Gulf states. I think Mississippi is the cheapest today, but there's a cluster of states that are all within about 10 cents of each other, all of them generally in the South.
Well, see, that's what's so infuriating to hear, because California basically is in that category. We have proximity to oil production and to refineries and to that infrastructure in California, but because of the regulations, they're shutting it down.
Yeah, and California had been a major oil producer over the years, and you look at areas like Texas that have decided to embrace the natural resources that they have, and Texas, the leading oil producer of any state in the country. California still had that opportunity, but a lot of this is politicized, shutting down wells, making it very difficult with stringent requirements, and that has led to a deficiency of the amount of oil produced in California. It's led to refineries that want to leave the state. In fact, over the next year, 2 refineries have basically said, we're going to be shutting down. So this is kind of the wrong way to go about it. Look at countries like Norway, extremely developed, plenty of oil, but many of the folks in Norway is still utilizing its natural resources and selling oil on the global market. And it's using that fund to necessarily go down a different road. But California has chosen not to use its resources, instead essentially shut them down.
In Norway, they're drilling for the oil that they have, but they're not using it in Norway. Is that the point you're making?
Yeah, essentially that. Countries like Canada as well, who have been making it a little bit more difficult for oil producers to raise production. Canada has some rather stringent environmental regulations as well. It took several years for Canada to finally build another pipeline that carries crude oil from Alberta. They built that pipeline because the Keystone XL pipeline was canceled by President Biden, and that gave the Canadians an opportunity to build a pipeline. So it just goes to show that instead of shutting down oil production, embrace it. And like Norway does, they're using that oil revenue to essentially move their economy. Many folks that live in Norway now have been incentivized with relatively affordable electricity and EV subsidies to
Yeah.
move over to electric vehicles.
On the electric vehicles, what's the position nationwide in here at home in America in terms of that move? Because sometimes you see these very big numbers put out by the industry, 25% of new car sales are EVs or whatever. But I think the actual penetration of EVs is still very low, isn't it, in America? Gas is the story in terms of personal transportation still.
Yeah, and absolutely. And when you look at a country and how many EVs it has, you look at a place like Norway or other European countries where EV penetration is much higher, and you look at their relative size compared to the US, they are very small. So they can build infrastructure relatively quickly. It can be readily available. And in the US, unfortunately, we're a much larger country. So, look at California, for example. There's a lot of EV penetration there, but as soon as you venture outside of California into other areas, if you want to road trip to another area of the country, there's a lack of infrastructure. And that's why Americans have been slow to embrace EVs, is because, very much like building a nationwide high-speed rail program, it's extremely expensive to build all of this infrastructure in such a large country.
And so do you see that ever changing? I mean, the people who are pushing all this, I mean, although it's just been overturned by the Congress, for example, the ban on gas car sales in California is going to be 2035. I mean, really, do you believe we'll ever be in a situation where we are 100% EV? Or is it, yes, it's going to happen, but it'll be 50 years from now, not 20?
Yeah, and a lot of politicians like to hurry to a deadline. They like to envision something, but at the end of the day, Americans still have choice. If Americans want to embrace it, leave that up to Americans. Politicians shouldn't be in the business of, putting things ahead and slowing down other areas. I mean, Americans clearly are not fully comfortable yet with going full EV. We've seen that in the numbers. In fact, manufacturers have actually seen a huge jump in the amount of Americans buying hybrid electric vehicles out of 100 to 200 miles of range. So, politicians can put arbitrary dates like 20 or 25 years and aim for it. But at the end of the day, Americans still are not ready to make that jump yet, because the infrastructure, because of the cost. I mean, EVs have become more affordable, but look at the repair costs. There's a lot of inherent shortcomings with EVs yet that still have to be challenged for broader adoption. And then the problem is, some states like California, where there's a lot of EV chargers, you go to the state of Wyoming, there may not be as much infrastructure. So that's also fragmenting and slowing down the ultimate shift over. But the one thing I want to mention here is that shifting all over to EVs can introduce some new problems. You look at what happened in Europe. Europe became far more reliant on Russia for energy. And then Russia waged a war on Ukraine, and now they're all going the opposite way. The danger here is putting all your eggs in one basket. So, going full EV and then not having the benefit of liquid fuels, I'm more of a middle of the road approach. Maybe EVs work in some larger cities, but maybe not everywhere. So I think politicians are arbitrarily saying, let's get rid of liquid fuels without also looking at the process, the amount of environmental damage caused by EVs, by mining for these precious metals as well, should be a factor.
I strongly agree with that. Well, talk about the EV repair cost a bit, and I guess just compare, the side by side, the overall cost, gas car versus EV car in an equivalent context.
Yeah, EVs are more expensive still to buy an electric vehicle, and that may be because the penetration's rather low. There's not as many manufacturers. So an internal combustion engine vehicle still has about a $10,000 or $15,000 lower price tag. The other difficulty with that's improving is the life of the battery generally has been improving, but the cost per mile still, because of some of these extra costs, the higher cost of insurance on electric vehicles, the higher repairability. I mean, electric vehicles are not necessarily conventional. You can't take them to any mechanic. So the costs are much higher of ownership on EVs when it comes to some of these factors. Now, yes, you don't have the oil changes, the routine maintenance on EVs, but ultimately right now, internal combustion engines, because they're still so popular, it's still so much in use, some of these numbers are lower on internal combustion engine vehicles. Of course, you do have to pay for fuel, but right now with gasoline nationwide at $3.12 a gallon, some of the lowest inflation adjusted numbers in quite some time, the calculation is shifting and EVs are becoming more expensive in some of these areas. That's, including the price tag, EVs, as I mentioned, quite a bit more. There's still some improvement for a lot of Americans to want to buy an EV. And that's why we're seeing kind of a niche develop of hybrid electric vehicles that are becoming far more popular than a full EV.
So I want to talk about hybrid in a second, but just on EVs, it's interesting because some of the evangelists, all the time, one of the things you hear them says, oh, look, I don't have to fill up my car with gas. It's so much more convenient, so much cheaper. But that's not really true.
Well, and especially in a place like California, the danger that also isn't mentioned is California's grid, which is decrepit. I mean, even over a year ago, Governor Newsom essentially asked EV owners not to charge your electric vehicle because of the risk of loss of electricity. So we're not fully built up there. That's the inherent problem that politicians look at, right? They pick a date, they want to have all EVs in their state, but they're not looking at the grid to support those electric vehicles, right? So that's the risk, is that what is an EV worth if there's no power to fill your EV up? You're going to be in a situation, I mean, the weather in California is notoriously unreliable. Do you really want to be in a situation in California or Florida and a major hurricane is heading for you? I mean, that's somewhat of the risk here, is that when you put all your eggs in the EV basket and when there's no electricity, what do you do? So, those are some of the weaknesses of EVs, is that you don't have the functionality. And I mean, there's a benefit here to liquid fuels. So, and that's what California's been cracking down on is liquid fuels, which have become a mainstay, which are cleaner than they've ever been, by the way. California has ultra clean diesel now, or ultra low sulfur diesel. Gasoline has the lowest sulfur content it ever has. And so, I mean, even outside of California, there have been huge improvements in how internal combustion engine vehicles work and the fuels, how clean they burn.
Exactly. I mean, that's one of the points I make in my plan for reducing the gas price. A lot of the regulations, the special blend for California, for example, this is all based on what was happening in the 1970s, with smog in LA, and car technology is so much better. The fuels are so much better. It's totally unnecessary now.
And like you said, I mean, the one thing that I've certainly advocated for is let's come up with a common sense nationwide blend of gasoline that can be used year round, that can satisfy, pollution, because nobody wants to wake up and, you look outside. And I mean, I think of all the Canadian wildfire smoke that's down in my neck of the woods right now. Nobody wants to wake up to those skies. So let's come up with a nationwide standard instead of doing a piecemeal standard in California, a different standard in Arizona, a different standard nationwide. All of these standards lead to fragmentation and can increase costs. Let's come up with a common sense approach that can work for everyone. And, let's do it as clean as we possibly can. But that in California, if you have more people, utilizing the same type of gasoline, that can reduce the cost for everyone.
To talk about that a bit more, because I've focused on it from California's perspective, but just that whole, why do we have different blends, summer blend, or what's that all about? What's the origin of that?
The Clean Air Act is the origin of that. And the Clean Air Act back in the 1990s, there were amendments made that the EPA would basically crack down and lead to cleaner air during the summer. I mean, some of these things we still have, like ozone action days when it gets extremely hot, because there are still challenges when ambient air temperatures are so high. So now it really depends on how many vehicles are in a given place. California is a state with a lot of vehicles, and that's why it has one of the most stringent blends of gasoline in the country. But major cities across the U.S., Chicago, Detroit, New York, a lot of these big cities use types of gasoline that are cleaner because the sheer amount of vehicles on the road that are burning gasoline. So, it would make sense, though, that everyone burns a very similar type of gasoline across the country, not that these are just put in cities that are larger. So if everyone can get on the same page, we come up with one standard, we can reduce prices. I understand that the environment needs to be clean, but I mean, California kind of in a league of its own with a low carbon fuel standard. cap and trade program that, by the way, was rescinded in Canada. Even Canada is getting rid of the federal carbon tax that they had. So maybe it's time for California to start following in what Canada is doing.
That's such an, I hadn't realized that. That's part of my plan. Repeal the low carbon fuel standard and the cap and trade system. So Canada repealed cap and trade.
Canada repealed the federal carbon tax. Now there's one
Okay.
province still, Quebec still has the federal carbon tax, but that was paused for much of Canada by Mark Carney. And we'll have to see. It will take an active legislator in Canada to make it permanent. But what Canada found is that these programs simply aren't working the way they were designed to do. And now, in addition to California's a cap and trade program and low carbon fuel standard, Washington State also implemented a cap and trade program, which immediately caused the price of gasoline in Washington State to go up, because essentially refiners have to pass the cost on to consumers, right? Because consumers are the ones buying gasoline. And so the cap and trade program in Washington State, back when I think it started in 2023, Oregon and Washington long had very similar gas prices within a few cents a gallon. As soon as Washington State implemented a cap and trade program, the price of gasoline in Washington State jumped about 30 cents a gallon. So, you see it very quickly, the impacts of these programs. Oil companies, they are the ones producing fuels. There's no margin built in where oil companies can somehow survive losing billions of dollars a year. So these costs get pushed down to the people that are consuming the actual products, in this case, you and I.
Could you just ask you, I'm just interested technically in how the seasonal blends work. I mean, is there a date? And then the deliveries to gas stations change. How does it work?
Yeah, there are dates in California. There's actually, I think, 5 different regions of the state of California that make the changeover depending on basically the air temperatures. So Southern California, because Southern California is more southerly and it gets warmer earlier in the southern half of the state, the switch from winter to summer gasoline happens first in the southern part of the state, and then it kind of moves north. And so you have different counties essentially that are having different types of gasoline, and that can be a logistical nightmare. Imagine the requirements. If you're a retailer and you're a refiner, you have to produce these various types at various dates. And if one issue happens, if you have one cog in the wheels that messes things up, that's where these spikes in gas prices come from, is because it's very difficult to get all of these different blends rolled out successfully. So essentially that's what you see across the country as well. Is there are dates in California. I'd have to pull them up, but they're mandated by the Air Resources Board. I believe they start as early as March in the southern half of the state, and then April for the northern half of the state. And basically that summer gasoline is kept either through October or November, depending where you are in California. So the summer gasoline season in California is about 9 months, and the winter gasoline season is only usually about 3 months or so.
I mean, do you think that we should be getting to a point where you don't need a seasonal blend? You can just have an acceptable level that's simpler and one blend for the whole year.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense, because here's the problem. When you're switching back and forth, gasoline cannot be held for 3 months sitting in storage tanks. So part of the reason why we see a big price spike when we make this transition from winter to summer is because there's no summer gasoline at the beginning of the season. Only does that supply start building up as refineries are getting a little bit ahead over the course of the summer. And of course, when that inventory is built up to satisfactory levels at the end of the summer, we switch back to winter. So, if we move to a year-round blend, instead of having to worry about, inventory levels, going from adequate to low and then back to high, we can just keep a consistent. I mean, that would be one step in improving the system, is just stay on the same blend year-round. I mean, then supplies can eventually build up and you don't have to worry about all of this rigmarole of going back and forth.
Great word, rigmarole. But I think that it's a classic example of government making things overcomplicated and micromanaging everything. And then it just becomes more costly for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, governors and people, bureaucrats are not petroleum analysts. And so, if you sat down with one, a petroleum analyst would say, here's a couple things that you should do logically that are impacting prices. But, nobody's been able to get through to that in California, and they've just continued to layer and layer and layer more rules and more regulations. I mean, now it's to the point where California's governor is now telling the CEC, we've got to fix this.
I know, it's embarrassing.
Yeah, is the state really going to fix it? I mean, it should be rather, and keep in mind that Governor Newsom has simply said it's big oil's fault. But it's very interesting when you cross over into Nevada and Arizona, suddenly prices are much lower. Is the governor suggesting that big oil is only gouging in California? No, it's the rules and regulations in California that make a big difference.
Exactly, which we can change, and that's my plan to change it. But on the sort of implementation aspect of these different blends and so on, is that partly why you see even within California, quite a range of prices? So, and it doesn't seem to have any kind of logic to it in terms of rural or urban or whatever. But even now, I'm driving around the state the whole time, and you can see prices from $4.50 to $6. Just in the last week, I've seen that. So, what would be behind that?
Yeah, and right now we've seen a lot of refinery issues in Northern California, and this is where the declining number of refineries in California plays a key role. California has seen an 80% reduction in the amount of refineries since the 1980s, whereas the national picture is only down about 30 to 40%. So basically, California is seeing a huge loss in refineries. And when you see those different prices, there can be a price that's 30 cents a gallon higher or lower in Northern California, in the Bay Area. There's two distinct markets in California, basically the LA market and the San Francisco market, because there's refineries in both of those areas. And if a refinery goes down in Southern California, it's going to cause the price of Southern California gasoline to spike, but maybe not impacting as much of Northern California. So, and it can be the flip. Most notably here in the last couple of months, a pair of refinery fires in Northern California has imperiled the price of gasoline for the northern half of the state. So they don't always move in tandem. These markets are somewhat connected, but somewhat disconnected, especially when refinery issues happen in one area. That may become the epicenter for the highest prices. And sometimes it could be, Seattle, the market there, the Pacific Northwest could be sky high. It could be Northern California, or if it was 2015 and there was a refinery fire in Southern California, then you can see prices skyrocket more in Southern California. So, I mean, that's just one of the complex layers. Sometimes it does come down to competition as well. Are there many stations where you're looking to fill up? Are you near, are you in Hollywood where, you have the Jay Lenos that aren't shopping around because people aren't as price sensitive in some of these areas. So that's where gas stations may charge more because they know people aren't going to spend time shopping around looking for lower prices.
I mean, you've got these fluctuations depending on the factors you've outlined. People talk about the global price, which moves around all the time. How much of just talk about that a little bit, and how much of any changes, it's not just in California but elsewhere, are really driven by the global price and how that is set and how that works.
Yeah, it's very similar to it's a market-based price. And so when you explain to people the oil market, it's not too dissimilar to, say, the housing market. When there's a lack of homes and California's been hit very hard by this, right? Home prices have skyrocketed because there's a lack of homes. Now, the oil market's a bit more liquid, right? Because there's organizations like OPEC, which control a third of the world's oil supply. And when OPEC, it's kind of like a big home builder. Imagine if a big home builder said, we're going to flood the market in California with homes. The home price may go down. But in this instance, OPEC is a big organization, produces a lot of crude oil. And so what they decide to do strategically can have a major impact on the price of oil. And that's been the case so far this year, is OPEC has decided to increase oil production, and that's pushed the price of oil to about $61 or $62 a barrel. That's much lower. So things like Iran, Russia, right? There's a lot of headlines with these countries, Russia and Ukraine. Will there be a ceasefire? Will there be peace or something? That could heavily influence oil prices, because right now, much of Russia's oil has been heavily sanctioned. So if Russia agrees to a ceasefire, that may allow those business ties to normalize, and Russia could supply the global market with more oil. So that's a major headline that could impact oil. There's also the possibility of a nuclear deal with Iran. Iran's also a major oil producer. If there's a nuclear deal with Iran, it would likely involve sanctions relief, which would allow Iran to produce more crude oil. And overall, there's been trade tensions that will, potentially impact the broader economy, and not only just our economy, but the global economy. So the price of oil is constantly fluctuating on a daily basis, depending on if the market sees more oil coming online in the future, or if there's a possibility of less oil, such as the case during 2022, when Russia just started the war in Ukraine. Oil prices shot up to $130 a barrel because at that moment, there was the distinct possibility that Russia was not going to be able to sell as much oil due to sanctions. So The price of oil is constantly fluctuating based on the perception of how these global instances or situations could impact the amount of oil on the global market.
But it's one price regardless of the source. So it's like one pool, basically.
Well, and that's the complexity of it. There's not just one quoted price. A lot of the time you turn on the TV, you watch these business channels, you'll hear oil is this. But it's not definitive because there are many different, it's kind of like going into an auto parts store. There's not just one type of oil on the shelf, right? There may be a dozen different types. So these are benchmarks. When you hear the price of oil is this, it's kind of a benchmark, meaning it's a barometer for what the oil market is doing. If you hear the price of oil $61, there's some types of oil that may be 50, maybe $45. There may be some types of oil that are 65, 70, even $80, depending on their quality. And that's what varies. Refineries are built to process specific types of oil. And so amongst those oil prices, there can be fluctuations as well that are higher than the price of oil you hear or lower than the price of oil that you hear. So there's a lot of different types of oil and they all change in price as well.
Yeah, amazing. I want to get back to hybrids. I'm just very interested in that. And I feel like for some reason, there's a hostility in terms of policymakers to hybrids. Just talk about hybrids and what's going on and why it seems to be all EV and hybrids are just, pushed aside.
Well, I think this is a great point. I mean, a lot of people that are in the EV camp say, well, hybrids are silly because you still have the maintenance of an internal combustion engine vehicle. And a lot of politicians don't want to talk about continuing to use fossil fuels, even if they are clean, even if it does make a lot of sense. The problem is right now, the infrastructure is not there coast to coast. That's why Americans are not fully committed to buying EVs everywhere, right? Americans are worried that maybe they can charge at home, but heaven forbid they leave home. They can't take an extension cord with them and be plugged in all the time. So what Americans are buying right now is telling us that we haven't done a terrific job in giving them the confidence to make an EV. And so a lot of Americans are more interested in a hybrid, myself as well. I live in a major city and I don't want only 30 or 40 miles of range, right? Because I sit in traffic. I want something with 100 or 200 miles of range that would allow me to do 80% of my daily living on EV. But heaven forbid, I actually want to go outside of my area. Then what do? I don't know, if I take a road trip to the middle of Wisconsin, is there going to be an electric vehicle charger? And so I think the mild hybrid is being overlooked because politicians want to go full on. They want to rip the Band-Aid off. They think it's great. They don't want to use fossil fuels, but that's not realistic. And so, politicians are going full on to the deep end and deciding we're going to go all the way, even if it's incredibly costly. Let's not take baby steps to get there. Let's just go the full way. And I think the answer right now is the mild hybrid, something that has, 100 miles of range that still has the benefit of an alternative power supply. And my world is perfect because, again, Europe made the mistake of relying on Russia. I don't want to make the mistake of going full EV and then, heaven forbid, one day Mother Nature or something gets in the way of that. I have a backup.
100%. I can speak from experience. I've been on the road a lot the last 3 years, actually, in California. And a couple of times, unbelievably, the rental place said, we only have EVs. It's a nightmare. When you're renting, you have no idea where to charge them. You're terrified about getting to the next thing. And then one time I do remember having a hybrid and I only realized it. And the range looked okay, but I was doing a long trip from San Diego into the interior, into Imperial County, over the mountains. And I suddenly realized I'm not going to make it with the charge. But then I realized it was a hybrid and I just found a local rural gas station and it's fine. But it's so impractical. That's what I always say. The way politicians do all this stuff, it's so ideological. But you've been incredibly helpful about all of this. Just your final thoughts on what's going on and what you see happening across the country and in California in terms of this whole issue.
I'd love to see politicians be more pragmatic instead of just trying to go full on one way. Americans don't like sudden massive shifts. We're seeing that in what they're doing. Americans are also telling us in California they're sick of sky high gas prices. And, politicians have gone, again, kind of the same way. They've gone full off. And so we're now seeing it because the plan hasn't been fully implemented. Gas prices in California continue to go up. And it's just layers and layers of bureaucracy that we need to go and look back at a common sense approach. What can satisfy us? Let's do it together. Let's all move forward towards the goal. But there's no reason gas prices need to be sky high in just California to achieve these goals. There's ways to do this that don't involve gas prices being sky high. So, more of a common sense approach can win over. And hopefully, you're able to deliver some of that common sense.
There you are. Perfect. That's my plan. Patrick, so great to see you. It's a real thrill to meet you and really appreciate all your insights. Thank you.
And thanks for bringing me on. Really appreciate the ability to chat with you.
Well, that is our show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you check out Big Ideas Book Club. There are some really good conversations that you may well have missed if you're not keeping up to speed with that. Great one with Oren Cass, who runs American Compass, really the leading intellectual force behind the kind of Trump populist movement that obviously I talk about a lot. But Oren puts it all beautifully, and we got into the issues around trade and tariffs and manufacturing. Fantastic conversation. He's got a really important new book out, and we talked about that. And then an old friend of mine, Ed Luce, on a very, very different topic than we normally get into, but I thought it was fascinating. He's written a biography of one of the leading statesmen in America over the last half century. This is Big Brzezinski. And it led to some fascinating discussions about foreign policy, international relations, and how things work at the very, very highest level of American government in the Nixon administration and Henry Kissinger, such a major figure in politics and policy over the last many decades. Really great conversation with Ed Luce. Big Ideas Book Club. Check that out. And remember to support my campaign for governor, Steve Hilton for governor.com. It's a very, very important time in our campaign. If you want to support me in my run for governor, and if you are able to give me any kind of financial support, this is the time to do it, because we have a very big deadline coming up at the end of June. So if you'd like to see me elected in California so we can turn this beautiful state around and make it golden again, go to Steve Hilton for Governor, FOR, Steve Hilton for governor.com. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.